Welcome to a new audio and video recording in the collection on post-growth planning. My name is Lamker, Assistant Professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In the following, we are able to listen and to see Sarah Ware from Central European University in Vienna, Austria. She will talk about feminist perspectives in post-growth planning. The recording is taken from Sarah's visit to the course Critical Approaches to Global Sustainability Challenges at the University of Groningen Faculty of Spatial Sciences. The recording is from 19th March 2026. The course is taught each year by Ethemcan Turhan and myself. And now, let's tune in. So Ethemcan and me, and we are all very happy to have you here, Sarah, to somehow finish off our course.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and a big thanks to Christian for the invitation to come and speak with you today. My own personal background is in environmental planning, and then I went on to work in planning practice for about 8 or 9 years. And after I got a little bit disillusioned there, I decided to come back to academia and do my master's in social ecological economics and planning in Vienna, and I stayed on to do my PhD there. So I'm just finishing that now and working in really looking at this intersection between urban planning, feminist perspectives, and participation to democratize social ecological transformations. I'm now taking a bit more of a focus on housing studies in Vienna and in a couple of other global contexts. So that's basically where I've come from and where I'm at now, in case we can sort of tie in and link up some of those other topics that's a bit outside of the scope of today, but happy to discuss these perspectives or others with you in that broader context as well. But today I would like to bring to your attention some of the feminist roots of post-growth planning and feminist roots of planning more generally. So today, I'll just briefly talk to you about what post-growth planning is. I know that Christian's given you a really, really good run through of that, so I'll just skim over that. And then we'll actually look a little bit back into history at some of these contested historiographies, so essentially rewriting planning history from a feminist perspective. And that will lead us into a discussion where we can look at some of these problematics around hierarchical dualisms that feminism revealed, and some ecofeminist perspectives there on the separation of humans from nature. I'll then relate that a bit to some of my own work on spatio-temporal infrastructures, and then we can conclude with some of what I think are the more important lessons from feminist perspectives, and that will launch us into what I hope will be a very interesting discussion. So starting very briefly, what post-growth planning is and why it's important. At least from my perspective, I think what post-growth planning does very well is that it places a focus on sufficiency instead of efficiency. That's not to say that efficiency isn't important, but it really decenters that economic logic of efficiencies in order to do more and in order to produce more. It also enables this plurality of values that really questions those hegemonic notions of progress and development that often get us into this loop of efficiency that then also carries on in terms of developing infrastructures and pathways that really lock us into certain types of development. And in doing so, it challenges this capitalist reproduction of space and notions of linearity that really ties into this idea of progress and development, where we find ourselves being able to think about how we can use space in more ways than just for productive types of activities. It also positions society, and I think this is really, really fundamental, it positions society and the economy within its biophysical environment rather than alongside it. So you've probably all seen, there's 3 interlocking circles of the society, the economy, and the environment, with this space for sustainable development in between. Post-growth and degrowth perspectives really draw our attention to the embeddedness of our reality, that the economy simply can't sustain itself without our interaction. And I think this is really, really important because it breaks us away from these dominant economic logics that are often really implicit in the types of activities that we do. And this was a really important insight for me coming from planning practice into social ecological economics was really making very explicit the underlying economic logics that really permeate a lot of the decision processes and structures that exist in many sectors. And post-growth and degrowth really grapples with what's already there. So it's not only interested in constantly building more and doing more in more innovative ways and new and everything exciting, but it also looks at our current material reality as well as the relations that we have. So with other people, with our built environment, with nature, and it looks at these relations and these existing material infrastructures and asks, how can we do things differently with what we've already got? And this really centers these questions of what are we doing? Why are we doing it? For whom is it? And who is actually performing these activities and being part of making these decisions? And this brings very front and center what I think is one of the most important things that we can talk about, which is how we can democratically enable and foster social and ecological transformations. Yin Zhu has this very nice quote that I like because it really brings forward the complexity of what we're dealing with when we engage in not only doing more and more the way it's always been done, but trying to do things differently. She says here that the spatialization of degrowth will mean that existing spatial structures may be maintained, reused, reshaped, recycled, removed, and replaced, while new ones may be added, depending on the context. This essentially means that everything is possible, right? So often people think of post-growth or degrowth as some kind of regressive contraction of development and prosperity, when in fact what it is a very selective and contextually dependent selection of ways of doing. And this means that in some instances we will need to build and construct new. But obviously the starting premise is to avoid that wherever possible. I'll take you now to this wonderful book by Leonie Sandercock that she edited in 1998. This was essentially an effort to make visible a lot of this invisible contributions that have been made in planning history. And she uses the starting point of the post-industrial formalization of the urban planning profession in response to what was a lot of really, really challenging health and social crises at the time. She highlights the broader range of utopian and grassroots movements that were happening, as well as a lot of the beginnings of problematic connections being made between gender and space. She, in one of the essays within the book, Susan Ware draws out these three different types of movements that were happening at the time. The first two are very well known. So the city practical being essentially plan making, this efficient city management that was really concerned with the organization of space. The city beautiful movement, which was more concerned with aesthetic urban form, as well as the formalization of space. But it was much more about creating beautiful civic spaces, large boulevards and the like. Susan Ware highlights that at the same time, there was this really grounded movement that she calls the city social. And this was essentially a grassroots women-led movement dealing with incremental planning and changes that were dealing with social and economic injustices that were underlying these urban problems. And Sandercock then brings into focus the problem of, in planning theory, even reproducing this idea that there were essentially these godfathers of planning, and that really sideline and invisibilize the contributions of women that were occurring at the same time. So this book brings a lot of those perspectives together. And one of the examples that we can take from this time was, of course, the incrementalist movement and a lot of women who were establishing settlement houses with the community and within the community, but also with the community. So they were not only participating in the space and benefiting from it, but also working there and shaping what was happening in this space. So the picture you can see on the right is the one kindergarten, which is one of many activities that were happening in Hull House. Other activities that were occurring were things like a cooking kitchen, as well as a cafe, coffee houses where people could come as alternatives to bars and things that were quite problematic and socially destructive at the time. It was also a place for political gathering. So these settlement houses were really connected with women's rights movements and workers, like labour movements of the time. And they were places of gathering and organising, as well as direct provision of care and by way of food and other types of supports to people working in the factories in the locality. On the left of the screen, you can see Jane Addams' wage map. So this was an example of some of the documentation that was happening around the conditions of people living in these areas at the time. These were extremely impoverished areas of the city, overcrowded and poorly serviced. This is a wage map. There was also a migration map showing the migrant background of the people living in those areas. And very much like today, it's not surprisingly correlated with lower wages for people from migrant backgrounds. But also what they found was that was generally the population or the parts of the city that were really wanton in terms of having a severe lack of access to basic services. So these settlement houses, not only did they directly meet those needs, but they also politicised the problems of that people were experiencing at the time. So we can compare some of these different historical planning philosophies and really position this city social there as something much less discussed and much less researched, actually, much less present in planning theory. And from I would actually also add there the city social ecological, which is essentially taking the more radical and transformative concepts and ideas, or let's say the underlying foundation of some of these movements like the Garden City movement or the regionalist movement that were also happening at the time, very utopian. But the more radical elements of those were essentially abandoned, and some of the, I guess, easier to implement ideas taken into contemporary planning. So, for example, transit-oriented developments build very much off the principles underlying the Garden City movement, but unfortunately, the ownership, the non-capitalist, non-accumulative ownership model of the Garden City was abandoned. So, bringing us into this, the contribution of, let's say, feminist planners and architects, they started to actually make connections between wage work, space, and this type of hierarchical or these dualisms in our economic system. Linda McDowell of the Matrix Collective made this observation that production based on waged labour in the marketplace is undertaken collectively in specialised locations, predominantly by men, but also by women, whereas household reproduction of this labour based on the unpaid labour of individual women is undertaken in isolation in countless decentralised locations. So what Linda is doing here, along with others in the Matrix Collective, was really problematising this spatial segregation along gendered lines. And this was essentially the way in which space was being shaped for the purposes of productive and reproductive activities. Now, obviously, the challenge with that, and something that was quite present, was that they observed not only was it obviously a problem with there being some assumptions of the man-made environment. So really at this time in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was predominantly men who were in decision-making positions. So there was very little representation of women and women's needs brought into those planning and development and construction stages. So at every stage, they critiqued that there was a lack of representation. What they could see in the way that decisions were being made was that there were essentially this spatialisation of gender norms along these paid and unpaid labour lines that I mentioned. They gave examples of this by demonstrating this fallacy of the way people at the time, decision makers, were thinking about space. So they were thinking of the city as the place of productive labour, and the home outside of the city centre, so in some kind of peripheral area, was the place of leisure. But actually for women who were undertaking a lot of unpaid work and care work, the place of the leisure was actually a place of work as well. So there were some conflicts and contradictions in the way that space and was being planned in those areas that didn't really match the needs of women who were occupying it during the day and for care and other responsibilities. So some examples they gave were, the planning of a meandering path around residential areas where people lived. But in fact, women with, a child pram, like a kinderwagen and shopping bags and the rest, didn't really want to take the path home that meanders. They would also like to efficiently get from A to B. So they revealed some of these and many other conflicts in terms of the way that space was being organised from a male perspective. So they really sought to politicise space and built form as reproducing intersectional inequalities. And I say intersectional because it wasn't only along gendered lines, but also racial and other marginalised community. So here, Leslie Wiesman, she wrote a really good book, Discrimination by Design. She talks here about that the appropriation and use of space are political acts. The kinds of spaces that we have or we don't have or are denied access to can empower us or in fact render us powerless. Spaces can enhance or restrict, nurture or impoverish, and we must demand the right to architectural settings which will support the essential needs of all women. So these types of observations from feminism were really important in highlighting that there are these very simplified, gendered hierarchical dualisms that maintain and reproduce inequalities. And some of those are, for example, as I've put here, humans and nature, men, women, paid labour, unpaid labour, productive, reproductive, fast, slow, efficient, inefficient. These are all underlying assumptions that lie generally with, along these gendered lines, and also, of course, as you probably already aware, in Marxist critiques and others, that it's essentially this valuing of the human-made environment over nature and over social reproduction and reproductive labour. And the problem, obviously, with that is that social reproduction and nature is really the foundation upon which society and the economy are able to function. I've put a picture here of a book by Val Plumwood called The Eye of the Crocodile. Unfortunately, she passed away before it was finished, but there was this one passage in this book which struck me really quite strongly, maybe a little bit personal as well, because she's an Australian environmental philosopher. And she recalls a story where she herself got attacked by a massive saltwater crocodile in the north of Australia. Now, the idea of this, for anyone, is probably shocking, but having seen how large these crocodiles are firsthand, this really gave me some kind of deep, I guess, panic feeling. She talks about this moment of, despite the fact that she'd been theorising and writing about this false separation of humans from nature, in this very moment where she was, where the crocodile's jaws landed on her, in this very moment, she wasn't having any feelings of the urgency of survival or anything. What struck her in this moment was complete denial. So she completely denied that this was happening, and it couldn't be happening because she was too important to be reduced to food. Right? What came up in this moment was this very deep underlying belief that we as humans have, that we are not just food, right? We are highly cognitive, intellectual beings that are doing lots of really important things, and we can't possibly be reduced to something as simple as meat. Yeah? So this reflection then that she made in years following this near-death experience was really fundamental, because she could then speak to how deeply embedded these assumptions are, and also point to and start to investigate, well, what are some of the physical things that we actually do, this physical separation that we create and that we institutionalize, that actually further deepens this illusion of separations between humans and nature. So for what's relevant for planning, I think, is things like zoning and other types of land use regulation that really relegate certain uses to certain areas, parts of the city or the region. And I think this can, of course, having buffer zones and things also further reinforces ideas that we have about the proper place for activities to happen, despite the fact that in reality it's not possible to sort of so simply and neatly order and organise the complexity of human and natural life, as well as the social relations that happen between them. What I really appreciate about feminist perspectives is that they throw up the idea of time and how we conceptualize time. And one of the things with that is this challenge of going and thinking beyond linear clock time. So, of course, our day is organized into minutes and hours and then days and weeks and months in the year. And this calendar thinking and linear clock thinking is, of course, necessary to help structure and organize our days. But it doesn't apply to everybody, and it doesn't apply for all times and hours. So what feminist time politics shows us is that time is really, it's non-linear when you understand it through daily practices, and when you think about it more in terms of interdependent and relational interactions that are less linear, that are less predictable. And this then allows us to think of time as also something that is non-linear, complex, rhythmic, cyclical, fluid, right? So our needs change over time. We're born in a position of needing a lot of care, and shortly before we die, we're again in a vulnerable position of needing, being very dependent on other people. So at these phases of our lives, as well as for those undertaking them, the way in which our day is structured and the way in which we relate to time is very, very different to when we're attending a university class or going to our paid job. So feminist time politics shows us that there are these very rigid linear clock time thinking that when we are in different phases, temporal rhythms in our life, it makes us feel very much out of time or out of step with the world around us. So by broadening this idea, we can actually enable a range of different temporal rhythms to feel normal, to feel possible. So we can enable different ways of doing things depending on how we structure our spatial and relational environments. And what was of interest to myself and a few colleagues was what happens when time and space intersect, right? So we took this lens of care and care to look at how compatible or incompatible existing spatial and temporal infrastructures are, and what spatio-temporal infrastructures for care might look like. We wrote a very nice paper that was published last year. This, I won't go into detail because I see the diagram here is very small, but essentially what we did was we thought about what spatio-temporal infrastructures might be necessary to enable a careful within an ecofeminist city. And here we problematized the existing limited ideas of what spatial and temporal infrastructures are, both physical and social. And we thought, well, what would actually be really important foundations for spatio-temporal infrastructures? And we propose here space beyond human-shaped space, thinking about time beyond human-shaped time, so natural rhythms as well. And from the social side of things, also time for participation. So that's different rhythms and time for activism and political activities, as well as different types of care. and also space for care. Yeah, instead of care being something private and only undertaken within institutions in our own home, what does it look like to rather enable and promote care in commons, and really holding spaces for care? So I think what feminist perspectives remind us to do is to slow down. Yeah, we don't need to work only with linear high-tech temporalities. We can also appreciate the complexity and the non-linear and the rhythmical and cyclical ways in which societies develop over time. They also remind us to scale out, not only up. So we constantly hear about scaling up ideas, which is essentially this falling into this narrative or this desire to take something that seems good and constantly replicate it and have more and more and more of it. But the idea of scaling out challenges us to think about the permeation of ideas in a slightly different way, maybe a bit more like a messy patchwork. And that's really essentially looking at what is already there and what activities are already happening or what needs there might be, and finding context-dependent ways to meet those needs, depending on what's already there, as well as what would actually make sense for the communities they serve. And this ties in with the last point, which I think is really, really important for post-growth and degrowth planning, which is that feminist perspectives, again, provide this very rich theoretical as well as practical and foundation to understand different ways that we can work. We can firstly observe what's there, understand what's there, and work with what's already there instead of what's against it. So it's very much a challenge to this modernist planning idea of bulldozing everything and starting with a blank slate, and rather really looking what's there in material and relational terms. So this invites us to really stop planning and designing to these unrealistic, ecologically unfeasible, and often very unrepresentative ideals. And perhaps more of a public service announcement than anything, but a reminder that feminist and decolonial and Indigenous perspectives have been really, really fundamental to the formation of post-growth and degrowth imaginaries. They permeate much of the economic research that is heterodox economics and many other fields, social provisioning, and a lot of other ideas about social metabolism that are becoming very prominent. So I would remind and invite all of you to kindly look for the feminist roots of the ideas that you're talking about and cite them and refer to them and share widely. So thank you very much. I would
Thanks a lot, Sarah, for taking us into feminist perspectives, into some of your own work. The published paper last year is accessible to all of us here as well. And a final call to then also rethink about the roots that are behind of some concepts that we may, I use the term now, carelessly use without thinking where do they come from, what are the underlying roots, assumptions, backgrounds, how they have developed over often a long time as well.